The Empire declared war at precisely noon. The human ambassador listened without interrupting, waited for the proclamation to end, then tilted his head slightly and asked, almost politely, "Would you prefer to start before lunch or after?" For a heartbeat, no one moved. I was standing to the left of the imperial dais, wearing the silver-violet sash of a senior protocol officer, close enough to see the expressions on both delegations. My duty was simple: witness the ceremony, record every word, and ensure the ancient rituals of diplomacy were followed exactly as tradition demanded. I had performed that duty dozens of times before. I had watched 73 governments surrender before the first shot was ever fired. That was how the Empire conquered worlds. Not with surprise attacks, but with overwhelming certainty. Their declarations of war were carefully choreographed displays of power, designed to break an enemy's resolve long before fleets entered orbit. The Hall of Accord was overflowing that day. More than 500 delegates from across the galaxy filled the towering chamber, every seat occupied, every conversation silenced as history unfolded. They had gathered expecting another swift capitulation, another civilization bowing before imperial authority. Instead, they witnessed something no one in the Empire had ever prepared for. A human who treated the declaration of war like a scheduling inconvenience. 32 vassal observers, 12 neutral recorders, one imperial war banner descending from the ceiling like a dark curtain over the future. The Emperor's voice filled the chamber, amplified through carved black pillars that had been designed to make every word feel older than law. By authority of the Varkish throne, he announced the Terran Union is hereby placed under formal declaration of war, pinning unconditional compliance, demilitarization review, and transfer of strategic command oversight. That was the sentence meant to break Earth. I knew the timing. I had helped arrange it. Noon, when hunger and stress weakened patience, full gallery to maximize humiliation, public record to trap human diplomats inside their own reaction. The Empire did not merely announce war. It staged war as gravity. Every species before humanity had responded properly. Some begged for delay. Some demanded private negotiation. Some collapsed into frantic side channels before the Emperor finished speaking. That was how the ritual worked. War was declared, fear entered the room, and the Empire controlled the next breath. Then Ambassador Thomas Caldwell looked at his wristwatch. Not a tactical display, not a panic alert, a simple human wristwatch with a brown leather band, absurdly playing beneath the light of 1,000 imperial projectors. He was a white-kinned earthborn man, in a dark suit, silver hair at the temples, calm blue eyes, and the relaxed posture of someone waiting for a late table reservation. He looked up at the Emperor, then at the war banner, then at the lunch carts being silently removed from the side corridor, because protocol assumed no one would eat after a declaration of war. And he asked, "Now or after lunch?" For 3 seconds, the entire Hall of Accord forgot its own importance. Translators checked themselves, recorders paused. A vassal ambassador from the southern spiral actually leaned forward, as if the human had spoken a lost military code instead of a question about food. The Emperor did not move. I did not breathe. Ambassador Caldwell adjusted one cuff and added, "I only asked because your declaration was scheduled for noon, and my staff was told the lentil soup here is surprisingly good." That was when I understood the first and most dangerous thing about humans. They did not always resist fear by shouting over it. Sometimes they made it stand awkwardly beside the appetizers. The Emperor's crest flared crimson. "You have been informed that your world faces imperial war." Caldwell nodded politely. "Yes, Your Majesty." Very clear. Excellent acoustics. Then he glanced toward the side corridor again. "So, should we proceed immediately, or are we allowing a recess?" A few human aides behind him remained perfectly still, but I saw one bite the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. The vassal saw it too. That mattered. The war banner still hung. The fleet holograms still surrounded Earth in violet light. The Emperor still commanded enough force to make most civilizations reconsider their own flags. But the rhythm was gone. The ritual had expected trembling. The human had asked about soup, and in that tiny, impossible pause, the Empire lost control of the room. The Empire had never been interrupted, because interruption was not included in the ritual. That was the first thing I realized while Ambassador Thomas Caldwell stood beneath the war banner, asking about lunch, as if the Varshish throne had merely announced a scheduling conflict. Imperial declarations were built like traps. Every word had weight, every pause had purpose, every hologram, every drumbeat, every violet fleet marker behind the Emperor existed to pull the target species into one emotional shape. Fear. Fear made them predictable. Fear made them bargain too early. Fear made them surrender things they had not yet been asked to surrender. I had trained for years to maintain that sequence. Protocol officers like me were not decorative. We were engineers of atmosphere. The temperature in the Hall of Accord was lowered 2 degrees before declarations, because cold made most species feel exposed. The ceiling lights narrowed toward the accused delegation, because isolation made groups look smaller. The lunch service was always removed at the moment of announcement, because ordinary comfort had to vanish when imperial consequence entered. Everything was designed to tell visitors, your normal life has ended. Thomas Caldwell had ruined it by noticing the soup. The Emperor's closest advisor leaned toward the throne and whispered something too softly for public translation. The Emperor did not answer. His crest remained crimson, but his voice stayed controlled. Ambassador Caldwell, this is not a recess matter. Your civilization has been granted one final opportunity to accept imperial terms before active conflict begins. Caldwell nodded again, polite as a man listening to a hotel manager explain parking validation. Understood. He reached into his jacket pocket. Half the Imperial Guard shifted. He removed a folded paper menu in the middle of a war declaration. I had not seen paper used in formal diplomacy since the museum wing opened. Caldwell glanced down at it. In that case, I will be brief. My delegation ordered before the announcement. So, I hope the kitchen is not being punished for your timing. A sound moved through the vassal section. Tiny, dangerous, almost laughter. The Emperor heard it. So did I. The war banner still hung overhead, but now it shared the room with a menu, and the menu was winning. The Emperor lifted one hand. The fleet projection expanded behind him, filling the chamber with violet ships, each one labeled with tonnage, range, and campaign history. There at last was the Empire, I understood. Scale, force, certainty. The proper machinery of dread. Your humor is misplaced, the Emperor said. These fleets are already positioned along Terran approach corridors. Your trade routes are mapped. Your border stations are within reach. Your colonies cannot be supplied without passage through space we can deny. Caldwell looked up from the menu and studied the fleet display. He did not laugh this time. That made the room lean toward him. He was silent for just long enough to show respect for the danger, but not fear of the theater. Then he said, "Nice formation." The Emperor's eyes narrowed. Caldwell folded the menu and placed it gently on the table before him. "Your Majesty," he said, "Earth understands the seriousness of war. That sentence should have restored the ritual. It should have given the Empire an opening." But he continued, "That is why we try not to announce one on an empty stomach." The human aides behind him remained stone-faced through sheer discipline. I had to admire them for that, though I hated the reason. The Emperor's voice cooled. "You believe flippancy will protect you." "No," Caldwell said. "Preparation well. Flippancy just keeps the room honest." That was when I felt the second fracture. The first had been laughter. The second was worse. The human was not joking because he had no answer. He was joking because the Empire had arrived at a moment he had already planned for, and he was refusing to let us choose the emotional tempo. For 6 centuries, the Varkish Empire had made species feel late to their own disasters. Somehow, beneath our banners and ships and perfect noon timing, the human ambassador made the Empire look like the one that had arrived behind schedule. Thomas Caldwell did not look like a threat, and that was precisely why the Empire underestimated him. If Earth had sent a general in ceremonial armor, the Hall of Accord would have known what shape of fear to use. If they had sent a fleet commander with medals across his chest, the Emperor could have answered with tonnage, borders, and glorious statistics. But Caldwell looked like a man who had once taught history at a small college, and still remembered where the good coffee was hidden. His dark suit had no armored seams. His shoes were polished but ordinary. His hair was silver at the temples. His voice was soft, and his face carried that weary human patience, usually reserved for delayed flights, tax forms, and relatives arguing at holiday dinners. He did not fill the hall with dominance. He made the hall work harder to justify its own. I had reviewed his file before the session. Every protocol officer reviews the target delegation. Ambassador Thomas Caldwell, Earthborn, former crisis negotiator, former congressional liaison, Terran Union Diplomatic Corps, age 56, white skin, no military augmentation, no known combat decorations, no personal guard beyond standard embassy staff. On paper, he was almost disappointing. The Empire expected humanity to hide behind aggression. Instead, Earth had sent a man who carried a paper menu into a war declaration and somehow made everyone else seem overdressed. The Emperor noticed the mismatch and tried to use it. "Ambassador," he said, "perhaps Earth chose poorly in sending a civilian voice to answer a military reality." Caldwell looked up, calm as ever. "Your Majesty, most military realities eventually become civilian consequences. We like to keep that in the room from the beginning." The answer was polite. That made it harder to punish. Around the hall, vassal delegates shifted carefully, the way people move when they want to react. But remember, they are being watched. The Emperor gestured, and a new projection opened above the dais. Earth appeared first blue and white, small beneath the violet arcs of Imperial reach. Then the display expanded to show Terran colonies, supply paths, resource dependencies, and predicted disruption points. Red circles appeared around vulnerable stations. Yellow lines marked trade routes the Empire claimed it could close within hours. The chamber dimmed until Caldwell stood in the glow of his own civilization's exposure. This was the part where most ambassadors changed color, lowered their voices, and requested privacy. Caldwell checked his watch again. I almost admired the audacity before I remembered I was supposed to hate it. The Emperor's crest flared brighter. "You continued to perform calm." Caldwell shook his head. "No performance, Your Majesty. I am genuinely hungry." Another near laugh trembled through the far benches. The Emperor ignored it with the discipline of a ruler, beginning to sense that attention was slipping through his fingers. He leaned forward. "Your homeworld faces imperial war. Your colonies face isolation. Your ships face interdiction. Your allies face consequence. Do you understand that your personal composure cannot change those facts?" Caldwell folded his hands on the table. "Of course. But your expectation of my panic cannot change our preparation." That sentence struck harder than any insult, because it gave the room a new frame. The Empire had assumed calm was denial. Caldwell presented Cal as evidence. He glanced at the 10 aides behind him. One of them, a young woman with a tablet, gave the smallest nod, the kind of nod staff give when a timer reaches the mark everyone else does not know exists. I saw it. So did Caldwell. So did I realize too late. No one on the Imperial dais. The human ambassador returned his attention to the Emperor. "You are very powerful," he said. "Your fleet is real. Your pressure is real. War is real. Nothing about lunch changes that." He paused, and the room leaned closer despite itself. But when someone declares war exactly when you predicted they would, using the terms you expected in the room you studied after moving the ships you already tracked, panic would be impolite to all the people who did the homework. For the first time, the Emperor's silence did not feel ceremonial. It felt interrupted from inside. Thomas Caldwell still looked harmless. That was the problem. The Empire had prepared to face human rage, human fear, maybe even human pride. It had not prepared to face human homework. The Empire mistook humor for fear, because tyrants understand laughter only when it belongs to them. In the Hall of Accord, jokes were permitted during victory banquets, retirement ceremonies, and carefully approved cultural exchanges, where no one laughed before the highest-ranking imperial representative did. Laughter during a declaration of war was classified unofficially as panic wearing a ridiculous hat. That was the explanation the Emperor chose, and everyone on the dais quietly accepted it, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was that Ambassador Thomas Caldwell was not breaking under pressure. He was choosing the one response our ritual had no prepared chamber for. The Emperor leaned back into the throne and signaled for escalation. I knew the gesture immediately. Phase 2. The hall lights narrowed further around the tan table. The violet fleet projections expanded until Earth seemed surrounded on every side by imperial markers. A diplomatic countdown appeared above the dais. Not a military timer, not yet, but a formal compliance window, counting down from 1 hour. Below it, surrender terms unfolded in 12 columns of elegant legal language, dense enough to make courage sleepy. Demilitarization Review, Strategic Command Oversight, Colonial Route Supervision, Civilian Broadcast Alignment, Security Tax Normalization. I had seen species surrender before reaching column 6. Caldwell looked at the document, reached for a glass of water, and took a sip. Not a nervous sip, a throat-clearing sip. Then he asked one of his aides, "Margaret, did they include the lunch recess clause in there somewhere, or is that under civilian broadcast alignment?" The aide looked down at her tablet with professional seriousness. "I believe the soup is currently unregulated, Ambassador." A tiny sound escaped from the vassal gallery. The Emperor's crest darkened. "You treat lawful imperial notice as entertainment." Caldwell set the glass down gently. "No, Your Majesty. We treat unclear paperwork as a public health hazard." Then he turned his attention to the surrender terms projected above him and lifted one finger. "For example, strategic command oversight sounds nicer than foreign control of Terran defense decisions. Civilian broadcast alignment sounds nicer than censorship. Security tax normalization sounds nicer than paying you for threatening us." He looked at me then, not crewy, but as if he knew protocol officers like me had helped polish those words until they stopped looking sharp. "Would you like the English version, or should we keep the velvet on the blade?" The translation carried the metaphor cleanly, and the room changed again. The terms did not vanish, but they became visible in a new way. Every soft phrase suddenly had teeth drawn around it. The Emperor spoke more slowly. "Ambassador, you are running out of time." Caldwell checked the countdown. "We still have 56 minutes. Plenty of time for lunch and a first reading." The Emperor's advisor stepped forward, voice cold. "Terran humor will not alter fleet positions." Caldwell nodded. "Correct. That is why we did not use humor for that part." The human aide named Margaret tapped her tablet once. Across the neutral recorder station, a series of blue transmission confirmations appeared. I saw them before most of the hall did. Public packets released. Neutral systems acknowledged. Allied embassies mirrored. Trade courts notified. Civilian advisory channels open. The compliance countdown continued above the dais. But now another clock had entered the room. One the Empire had not started. Caldwell folded the paper menu and slid it beside the water glass, as if clearing space for actual business. "Your Majesty," he said, "your declaration has been received, translated, annotated, and distributed to every neutral government, trade authority, press consortium, and allied civilian network, currently willing to stay awake through imperial legal phrasing." The Emperor went still. Caldwell continued. "We also included the fleet movements you made before the declaration, the supply contracts you canceled yesterday, the false piracy alerts near our routes, and the private pressure messages sent to 3 of our partners this morning." He paused, polite enough to feel merciless. "The lentil soup can wait if you would prefer to discuss evidence first." That was when I understood the lunch question had never been a joke. It was a measurement. The human had looked at our ritual, our timing, our Hunger Games, our countdown, and decided the Empire had arrived late to its own ambush. Earth had already prepared the table, and the Empire had mistaken the tablecloth for surrender. That was the third and most unforgivable error of the day. The first was declaring war at noon, because some imperial strategist believed hunger made diplomats weak. The second was assuming Thomas Caldwell's humor meant he was buying time. The third was failing to ask what the humans had been doing with their time before they walked into the Hall of Accord. Caldwell stood beneath the compliance countdown, with the calm of a man who had just moved from appetizers to the main course. The Emperor's fleet projections still surrounded Earth in violet light, but now, blue-tan data markers appeared across the hall's neutral recorders, spreading like ink in clean water. Not military threats, not secret weapons, evidence, shipping anomalies, fuel contracts, insurance spikes, Imperial Reserve activations, canceled diplomatic visits, sudden media restrictions in 3 vassal systems, quiet troop rotations filed under ceremonial escort duty, grain futures manipulated along TAN-adjacent routes. Even the Emperor's lunch schedule had been included, which felt unnecessary until Caldwell explained it with unbearable politeness. "Your declaration was not a surprise, Your Majesty. It was a pattern with catering." The vassal gallery went dangerously still. I felt my own sash tighten against my throat. Protocol officers study silence the way navigators study stars, and this silence had changed direction. It no longer pointed at Earth, it pointed at us. The Emperor spoke slowly. You suggest that humanity predicted Imperial action. Caldwell tilted his head. Suggest. No. Confirm. We predicted the announcement window within 19 minutes, the legal phrasing within 12% variance, and the fleet posture closely enough that our analysts owe each other several annoying beverages. Margaret, the human aide, did not look up from her tablet. The Manila office was closest on phrasing. They are being unbearable about it. Caldwell nodded gravely. They usually are. The Emperor's advisor snapped. This is not a game. Correct, Caldwell said. Games require both sides to know the rules. This was an ambush. Then he lifted one hand, and the Terran display rearranged itself into a timeline. It began 6 weeks earlier, when Imperial envoys had quietly withdrawn from 3 neutral conferences. Then came the repositioning of supply ships. Then the sudden wave of piracy rumors along Terran trade lanes, none verified, all useful. Then private warnings sent to smaller partners, suggesting that Earth was unstable, reckless, and unwilling to compromise. Then today's war declaration dressed as law, after weeks of preparation, dressed as coincidence. Caldwell, let the timeline hang there for everyone to read. We knew you would want the first public sentence to be yours, he said. That is why we waited. You wanted to announce war. We wanted everyone to know you had been preparing it while pretending to negotiate. The compliance countdown continued above him. Suddenly ridiculous. 51 minutes, 50:49. A timer built to pressure humanity now measured how long the Empire had to watch its private intentions become public record. One of the neutral recorders requested source authentication. Margaret sent it instantly. Another asked if Earth would permit independent review. Caldwell said, "Please do. We prefer footnotes with witnesses." The Emperor's crest darkened to a shade I had only seen once before, during a succession crisis that everyone later agreed had been a misunderstanding, with excellent security. You have no authority to put the Empire on trial. Caldwell's face remained mild. No, Your Majesty. We have lunch reservations, open channels, and evidence. Authority can catch up. That was when the first external responses began arriving. A neutral trade court acknowledged receipt. A medical shipping union requested clarification on Imperial route closures. 3 border governments asked why their private messages had matched the Terran timeline. A vassal finance ministry, forgetting perhaps that the hall feed was public, requested immediate confirmation that war risk guarantees remain valid. The Empire had announced war to make Earth look alone. Instead, before the soup course would have cooled, Earth had made the Empire explain itself to everyone it needed quiet. Caldwell looked at the untouched menu one last time, then back at the throne. You asked whether we understood war, he said. We do. That is why our first move was not military. He tapped the table once. War begins with who controls the story of why it started. And Your Majesty, you declared war after we had already set the table. The first move was not military, and that was why the Empire did not recognize it as an attack until it had already landed everywhere that mattered. The Violet Fleet projections still circled Earth above the Hall of Accord, enormous and theatrical. But the real battle had moved into quieter places. Court registries, insurance exchanges, neutral newsrooms, emergency shipping boards, civilian advisory networks, and the private inboxes of officials who had been told all morning that this would be a clean Imperial announcement. Thomas Caldwell remained seated at the tan table, with his folded paper menu beside one hand and a glass of water beside the other, looking less like a man under threat than a patient lawyer waiting for the other side to realize the hearing had begun. The Emperor's advisor demanded that the tan transmissions cease immediately. Caldwell raised his eyebrows. Cease public distribution of verified evidence during a declared war proceeding. He glanced toward the neutral recorders. That sounds like something the recorders may want to note. They did. Every neutral recorder in the hall lit amber, which meant procedural relevance, which meant the Empire could no longer pretend the room was only hearing Imperial words. The advisor's expression tightened. You are manipulating neutral institutions. Caldwell nodded toward the Violet Fleet display. We learned from watching professionals. A sound moved through the vassal gallery, sharper than amusement and more dangerous than agreement. The Emperor raised one hand, and a new projection opened. Formal mobilization authority, clean and legal, with Imperial seals rotating above the command line. This was supposed to restore scale, warships, ranks, orders, obedience. Instead, Margaret tapped her tablet again, and the Terran display answered with civilian protection confirmations. Terran medical corridors registered under neutral law, human evacuation advisories sent to allied ports, non-competent travel guarantees filed with 3 trade courts, open invitation for neutral observers to monitor Terran supply routes, emergency agricultural reserves activated and published by region. No secrets, no panic, just preparations, stepping into daylight. I had expected human defiance to look like threats. It looked like paperwork with witnesses. The Emperor's voice deepened. You believe legal clutter will stop Imperial fleets? Caldwell took a slow breath. No, Your Majesty. Legal clarity will make every fleet movement mean exactly what it means. That sentence changed the home more than the fleet display did. Empires thrive in gray spaces. Patrol becomes pressure. Pressure becomes enforcement. Enforcement becomes unfortunate necessity. But the humans were coloring every gray space before the First Order could hide inside it. If an Imperial ship moved toward a hospital route, everyone would know. If a supply line was blocked, everyone would know. If a vassal system was pressured to deny aid, everyone would know. The Empire could still act. It could no longer act cleanly. The first outside condemnation arrived from a neutral medical league 3 minutes later. Then a civil navigation guild suspended cooperation with any war action affecting registered evacuation routes. Then a financial exchange froze risk instruments tied to Imperial border speculation until disclosures were reviewed. I did not understand half of it, but I understood the Emperor's silence. The humans had not fired. They had made firing expensive, in ways admirals hate explaining to accountants. Caldwell finally unfolded the paper menu and glanced at it. Lentil soup, he said softly. Still an option, apparently. The Emperor leaned forward, rage held so tightly it had become formal. Ambassador, you are testing Imperial patience. Caldwell looked up. No, Your Majesty. You tested ours for 6 weeks. We are simply publishing the results. Margaret leaned toward him and murmured something. Caldwell nodded. Then he addressed the room, not the throne. The Terran Union has opened crisis channels for any system wishing to avoid escalation, humanitarian disruption, or accidental complicity. We will receive questions during the recess, assuming lunch is still permitted under Imperial law. The neutral delegates moved first, checking their devices, then the vassals. Then, worst of all, several Imperial logistics clerks near the lower Ds began whispering into internal channels. The Emperor had announced war to isolate Earth. Earth had responded by making isolation administratively impossible. I watched Thomas Caldwell lift his water glass, calm as noon sunlight, and understood the horror of human diplomacy. They did not need to control the biggest fleet in the room. They only needed to make the room ask who had been lying before the fleet arrived. Lunch ended before the Empire did, and that was the most humiliating part of the afternoon. Not because the meal itself mattered, though Ambassador Thomas Caldwell did in fact eat the lentil soup with calm appreciation. While the compliance countdown continued above the Imperial Desus, it mattered because the Empire had designed the hour to pressure Earth, and Earth used the same hour to pressure the Empire back, without raising its voice. Every few minutes, another update arrived on the neutral recorders boards. A border commerce syndicate requested emergency clarification on Imperial fleet insurance. A coalition of independent ports suspended discretionary refueling contracts pending conflict review. 3 vassal parliaments announced public hearings on whether their supply lanes were being used for an undeclared pre-war buildup. A civilian broadcast consortium mirrored the Terran evidence packet in 61 languages, including 2 dialects the Empire had spent years convincing itself were politically irrelevant. Caldwell finished his soup somewhere between the 3rd legal inquiry and the 1st Imperial logistics delay. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, set it down, and asked Margaret whether the bread rolls were local. She said yes. He nodded and said, "Compliments to the kitchen." I nearly hated him for that. The Emperor did. I could tell by the stillness. Imperial rage, when properly trained, does not shout. It becomes colder, more precise, more ceremonial. He had announced war, expecting Earth to shrink under the shadow of consequence. Instead, he was forced to watch consequence develop a schedule of its own. The fleet hologram still showed Imperial ships in threatening formation, but new icons kept appearing beside them. Observer pings, legal monitors, civilian route overlays, humanitarian warning zones, financial risk flags, and independent media trackers. The war map had become crowded with witnesses. That was not supposed to happen until after the first campaign report, when the Empire could shape the story. Humans had dragged the story into the room before the fleet could move. The Emperor's advisor leaned toward the throne again, whispering urgently. I caught fragments through the protocol channel. Allied response slower than projected. Northern Corridor authorization pending. Supply insurers requesting review. Vassal Fuel Ministry, asking for written indemnity. The words sounded dull. That was why they were terrifying. The Empire was not being challenged by a heroic speech. It was being delayed by forms, contracts, optics, and questions from people who suddenly realized war might send them invoices. Caldwell looked up at the compliance clock. 42 minutes remaining. He seemed almost sympathetic. Your Majesty, he said, war is easy to announce, harder to coordinate after everyone reads the preparation notes. The Emperor's voice cut across the hall. Do not mistake hesitation for weakness, Ambassador. Caldwell held his gaze. I would never. I am asking you not to make the same mistake. That answer landed with unbearable neatness. The vassal gallery went silent again, but now their silence had weight of its own. They were not waiting for the Emperor's next command. They were waiting to see if the command would still work. A naval liaison appeared in the lower projection field, bowed to the throne, and requested private confirmation before advancing the First Fleet Group. Private confirmation. In the Hall of Accord during a public war declaration, I felt the ritual crack so loudly, it might as well have been stone. The Emperor stared at the liaison. Caldwell glanced at Margaret, who passed him a small plate with a bread roll on it. He did not smile. That would have been too cruel. He simply broke the roll in half and let the Empire's silence explain itself. Reports kept arriving. One Allied monarchy asked whether the Empire had misrepresented negotiations. A neutral legal institute opened a live commentary panel. 2 shipping houses paused service to Imperial forward depots until civilian exemptions were clarified. None of these actions defeated the Empire. Not one. But together they did. Something worse in that moment. They made the Empire slow down in front of everyone. Caldwell looked at the war banner overhead, then back to the throne. You wanted Earth frightened before lunch, he said. Instead, the galaxy got curious. And from where I stood, beneath all that violet light and dying ceremony, curiosity looked far more dangerous than fear. The fleet stopped moving first, and that was when the Hall of Accord understood that power can hesitate even while pretending to stand tall. The Emperor had not withdrawn the declaration. The war banner still hung from the ceiling, violet and black, heavy with 6 centuries of conquest language. The compliance countdown still burned above the dais, each number losing authority as it fell. The fleet projection still showed Imperial formations around Terran approach corridors. But the first forward group remained exactly where it had been 12 minutes earlier. Not because it lacked engines, not because Earth had threatened it directly, because every possible movement now had witnesses, costs, questions, and consequences attached to it before the order could even travel from throne to bridge. Ambassador Thomas Caldwell watched the frozen fleet markers with the same expression he had worn while reading the lunch menu. Cone, almost sympathetic. That made it worse. An Imperial Fleet Marshal appeared on the secure projection, requesting revised engagement authorization due to altered diplomatic conditions. Altered diplomatic conditions. I nearly laughed then, and the fact that I nearly laughed frightened me more than the humans had. That phrase meant the Empire's own commanders no longer knew whether the war they had been told to begin still belonged to the Empire story. The Emperor's voice was cold enough to turn ceremony brittle. Marshal, your orders are clear. The Marshal bowed. Yes, Majesty. However, neutral medical corridors have been publicly registered across 3 projected lanes, and Allied fuel guarantors have requested indemnity before release of forward reserves. Additionally, civilian media relays are tracking fleet telemetry in real time. Caldwell looked down at his bread roll. Not smug, not triumphant, simply waiting. The Emperor's advisor snapped. Proceed under Imperial authority. The Marshal hesitated. That one breath became the loudest sound in the hall. Authority had met logistics. Logistics had asked for a signature. Caldwell finally spoke softly enough that everyone had to listen harder. War is easy to announce, harder to afford. The words moved through the chamber like a door opening in a room everyone thought was sealed. The vassal delegates understood first. They supplied ships, fuel, food, maintenance crews, spare parts, insurance backing, legal cover, and public silence. The Empire had always called those things loyalty. Humans had forced them to become line items. Another update appeared beside the fleet projection. Independent ports declined unscheduled military throughput pending review. Then another vassal procurement office requests written civilian exemption guarantees. Then another public confidence index unstable in 4 imperial markets. No battle had begun, yet the Empire's war machine was already stepping on its own paperwork. The Emperor stared at Caldwell. "You believe delays can save your species?" Caldwell shook his head. "No, Your Majesty. We believe delays reveal who was told the truth before the order was given." He folded his hands. "Your fleet is still dangerous. Your soldiers are still disciplined. Your empire is still powerful. But power that must lie to move smoothly becomes less smooth when everyone starts reading." The Emperor's crest flared, but the chamber did not shrink from it the way it had before. That was the hidden damage. Earth had not made the Empire weak. Earth had made the room aware that the Empire required cooperation from people it had trained not to ask questions. Now they were asking. A neutral recorder requested permission to attach the Marshal's delay statement to the public proceeding. The Emperor refused. The recorder logged the refusal. Margaret leaned toward Caldwell and whispered. 6 more systems mirrored the packet. Caldwell nodded. "Thank you." Then he looked back at the throne. "We can still use the recess productively. Open crisis talks. Preserve civilian routes. Let your fleets remain." Impressive from a distance. The Emperor's advisor hissed. "You are not in a position to dictate terms." Caldwell's expression did not change. "I am not dictating. I am offering you a chance to stop paying for a mistake you have not finished making." The first fleet marker moved, then not toward Earth, back half a degree into holding formation. Barely anything. A technical adjustment, an Imperial spokesperson would later claim. But the Hall saw it. The vassal saw it. The neutral recorders saw it. The humans saw it. The war banner still hung above us. But suddenly it looked less like destiny and more like fabric waiting for someone to explain the bill. The galaxy remembered the lunch question long after the Empire tried to rename it a procedural delay. Official Imperial records called the event a temporary strategic review. Neutral historians called it the noon reversal. Vassal diplomats who had a better sense of humor once they were out of range of the throne called it the soup declaration. I was there when the Emperor finally suspended the compliance countdown with 17 minutes still glowing above the dais, and I can tell you the sound it made was smaller than history deserved. No thunder, no collapse, just a soft chime. One polite tone from the Hall systems, and the war that had been announced with 6 centuries of Imperial confidence stopped moving because too many people were watching the machinery behind it. The war banner remained overhead until protocol staff remembered to retract it, which took far too long. During those awkward seconds, Ambassador Thomas Caldwell sat at the tan table with his water glass, his folded paper menu, and the unbearable calm of a man who had never once needed the room to believe he was in control. The Emperor announced that military action would be postponed, pending clarification of disputed claims, which was Imperial language for, "We stepped on our own shadow in public." Caldwell buttoned his suit jacket and bowed his head just enough to be respectful, not enough to be grateful. "Earth welcomes clarification." He said, "We especially recommend beginning with the 6 weeks of activity you forgot to mention before declaring war." The neutral recorders logged that too. I saw the Emperor's advisor close his eyes. No one applauded. That would have been crude. But the vassal gallery breathed differently. That was the thing humans changed first, in every room they entered. Breathing. Later, in the side corridor outside the Hall of Accord, I found Caldwell waiting beside a service cart, where the lunch staff had quietly placed 2 covered bowls of lentil soup. He offered one to me, as if we had just survived a long seminar, instead of a failed war ritual. I should have refused on principle. I did not. The soup was, as promised, surprisingly good. For a while, we ate in silence beneath a window overlooking the Imperial Gardens, where banners still snapped in the wind, as if no one had told them their symbolism had been damaged. Finally, I asked him the question that had bothered me since noon. "Ambassador, were you truly not afraid?" Caldwell looked at the bowl, then at the distant skyline, then gave a tired little smile. "Of course, I was afraid. War is not harmless, just because someone is ready for it. Then why the question about lunch?" He set the spoon down. "Because people who are ready do not need to rush. I thought about that for a long time. The Empire rushed. It rushed to stage the room, rush the fear, rush the surrender, rush the story before anyone checked the footnotes. Earth did not rush. Earth watched, documented, translated, prepared, and waited until the Empire made its thread in front of witnesses. Caldwell had not mocked war. He had mocked the assumption that fear would make humans late to their own defense. In the months that followed, the Varkish throne did not apologize. Empires rarely do, when delay can wear the costume of dignity. But the declaration never became a campaign. The fleets remained in review formation. The vassal hearings continued. Neutral courts demanded filings. Civilian corridors became standard treaty language. And every time an imperial official tried to revive the old pressure, some minor diplomat somewhere would ask whether the matter should be handled before or after lunch. It became a joke first, then a warning, then a proverb. When humans ask about timing, check the board. When humans mention food, read the documents. When humans seem calm, assume the homework is done. Years later, when I teach protocol officers about Terran diplomacy, I do not begin with their fleets, or their markets, or even their strange love of public argument. I begin with a paper menu placed beneath a war banner. I tell them about Thomas Caldwell, the white-kinned human ambassador who answered imperial war with a lunch question and made the most powerful room in the empire lose its rhythm. Then I tell them the truth. Our emperor learned too late. Humans were not calm because war was harmless. They were calm because the empire was already